Put that down, you're not staff. Oh wait, my mother-in-law said, her voice light, casual, sharpened just enough to draw blood. You are the help, aren't you? Laughter rippled across the dining table, soft and polite, the kind people use when they're not sure if something is a joke or a warning. Crystal glasses caught the warm light, silver cutlery chimed, and for a moment, it felt like even the chandelier was looking down on me. I kept my eyes on the plate I was setting. The spoon, the fork, the knife, I aligned them with steady fingers, like nothing had touched me at all. She insists on doing everything herself, my father-in-law added, swirling his wine. We told our son, you didn't marry a wife, you hired a live-in maid. More laughter. This time, clearer. More confident. They'd found their rhythm. My husband didn't look up. He just kept scrolling on his phone, the blue light washing his face in a dull glow. That, somehow, hurt more than the words. I straightened slowly and finally met my mother-in-law's eyes. Her lipstick was perfect, not a single line out of place. She smiled at me, the way people smile at waiters they'll never see again. If the guests need anything, she said, you know your role. My role, I repeated softly, tasting the words. Of course. I moved around the table, feeling the weight of every gaze that pretended not to be watching. Perfume, expensive and layered, mingled with the smell of roasted lamb and saffron rice. A golden evening, by all appearances. The kind people post on social media with captions about family and blessings. Don't look so serious, my sister-in-law whispered as I passed her chair. We're just joking. You're so sensitive. I smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. I had heard versions of that line for years, sharpened and reused until it fit any occasion. The outsider. The charity case. The girl from less. I picked up an empty wine bottle from the sideboard, my reflection warped in the dark green glass. Behind me, their voices blended into a comfortable hum, the sound of people certain the world would always bend in their favor. They didn't pause. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't wonder, even once, what I might be thinking. They thought I was just the help arranging their table. They still had no idea I was also the one arranging their future. The night air outside the dining room was cooler, quieter, like the house itself knew better than to speak. I stepped onto the balcony with the empty bottle still in my hand, the glass cool against my palm. Below me, the garden was lit by small ground lamps, their glow brushing over trimmed hedges and imported rose bushes my mother-in-law bragged about to anyone who would listen. You disappearing again? The voice came from behind me, low, annoyed. My husband. I turned slowly. He leaned against the doorframe, one hand on the handle, the other still clutching his phone as if it were more substantial than I was. I just needed air, I said. He scoffed, a small, careless sound, but enough to tighten something inside my chest. You make everything dramatic, he muttered. It was a harmless joke. You know how my family is. Yes, I said, keeping my voice steady. I do. He finally pocketed his phone, only to cross his arms, a posture he used when he wanted to look inconvenienced. Could you at least try to get along with them? They're trying. I let out a breath, soft, controlled. Is that what you call it? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice like someone preparing to deliver a lecture. They've done a lot for us. You should appreciate that instead of... Instead of what? I asked. His jaw tightened. Instead of acting like you're above them. The irony almost made me laugh. Inside, the conversation at the table swelled again, followed by another round of laughter. Their comfort was palpable, insulated, and absolute, like a bubble they believed I had no power to touch. I'm not above anyone, I said quietly. But I'm not beneath them either. My husband stared at me, confused by the calm in my voice. My composure always unsettled him, he preferred when I broke, because broken things didn't resist. You should come back in, he finally said. Mom thinks it's rude when you wander off. Of course she did. I nodded, turning back toward the garden one last time. The roses shimmered under the lights, pristine and oblivious, just like the people inside. He waited for me to move. I didn't. Not yet. Because the night was shifting, quietly, the way tides do before a storm. And none of them knew that a single signature had already changed who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. I walked back inside, the din of conversation washing over me like heat. The dining room hadn't changed, still warm, still golden, but something in me had. Or maybe it had simply settled, like dust finding its rightful place. I set the wine bottle on the sideboard and reached for a fresh one. My movements were steady, practiced, almost graceful, years of endurance turning into an instinct I never asked for but learned to carry. Finally, my mother-in-law said as I returned to the table. The guests were wondering if you got lost. A couple of them chuckled politely. They weren't cruel, just complicit, the kind of people who pretended not to hear insults because acknowledging them might disturb the comfort of the room. I began pouring wine, starting with the far end of the table. As I set a glass beside the eldest aunt, she gave me a sympathetic smile. Marriage is work, dear, she whispered. Especially when you come from different worlds. Different worlds. That was their favorite phrase, a polite veil over condescension. I nodded without reacting, moving behind chairs, feeling their eyes flick to me between sentences. A pair of cousins watched the way I held the bottle, whispering something to each other before looking away with little smirks. I didn't try to decipher it. Some kinds of disrespect are so small and habitual they don't even require translation. When I reached my husband, he didn't make eye contact. He lifted his glass without gratitude, as if I were a server drifting through. Careful not to spill, he murmured. I didn't. My hands were too steady for that. Across the table, my sister-in-law leaned forward. Actually, she said with a bright, saccharine smile, could you check the oven? I think the bread might burn. She said it loud enough for the whole table to hear, and a couple of guests looked surprised, as if unsure whether she was serious. But she held her smile, the kind that insisted I accept the role she'd assigned me. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I simply nodded and walked toward the kitchen, the soft click of my heels marking each step like punctuation. The moment the door closed behind me, the noise outside faded. In the stillness of the kitchen, I rested my hands on the counter and let myself breathe, slow, deep, deliberate. Because endurance has a sound. It's the quiet right before a fault line shifts. I opened the oven and checked the bread, though it was perfectly fine. And as the warm air brushed my face, I remembered something my lawyer had said earlier that afternoon, while sliding a folder across his desk. Once the papers are finalized, everything built on that land legally becomes yours. They had no idea they were dining above a truth that would break their world open. The bread was fine. Golden, soft, untouched by anything except their assumptions. I set the tray back onto the counter and wiped my hands on a linen towel, not because they were dirty, but because the action gave me a moment to gather myself. Footsteps approached behind me, light, hurried, performing concern rather than feeling it. Hey, my sister-in-law said as she slipped into the kitchen, voice dipped in false softness. Don't take it so personally, okay? You know how Mom jokes. I turned slightly. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, ankle lifted as she tapped one heel lazily against the wood. A casual pose, the posture of someone who had never been questioned in their life. I didn't take anything personally, I said. She tilted her head, studying me the way people study cracks in a wall, curious, but only enough to decide if it needs repainting. Good, she said. Because people were starting to feel awkward. You make the atmosphere heavy, sometimes. Heavy. A word used by people who lived entirely weightless. I placed the towel neatly beside the oven. I didn't realize my silence affected the entire table. It does, she said, shrugging. People notice when someone looks out of place. Out of place. Another one of their favorite phrases. You know, she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, Mom said earlier that maybe you'd be happier living closer to your side of the city. Something more comfortable for you. There it was. The suggestion wrapped in politeness. The invitation to shrink. I'll keep that in mind, I said calmly. She brightened, relieved I hadn't challenged her. Good. Anyway, they want dessert soon, so. I'll bring it out in a moment, I said. She nodded, satisfied, and slipped back through the door, the noise of the dining room swelling as she let it swing closed behind her. I stood in the quiet again. This time, I didn't breathe to steady myself. I breathed to remind myself of what they didn't know. In less than an hour, their family would toast to prosperity on land they believed they owned. Land they had insulted me upon. Laughed over. Belittled me from. And I would smile, serve dessert, and say nothing. Because the sweetest part of revenge is not the reveal, it's the patience right before it. And they still thought patience meant powerlessness. I carried the dessert tray out with steady hands, the soft clink of porcelain cutting through the low hum of conversation. They all turned as I entered, not out of respect, but because people tend to glance at anything that serves them. Finally, my mother-in-law said with a bright, polished smile. We were wondering if you fell asleep in there. I set the tray down in the center of the table. Steam rose from the small dishes, curling upward in thin, delicate strands, the only fragile things in the room that anyone acknowledged. Her friends cooed at the presentation, praising the dessert as if it had materialized from the kitchen itself, untouched by hands they didn't want to think about. I began passing out plates. One by one. Calm. Precise. Controlled. Careful with that one, my father-in-law muttered as I handed him his plate. She's clumsy. I wasn't. But I let the comment drift past me like smoke. As I leaned forward to set a plate in front of my sister-in-law, she whispered, smile more. People think you're upset. I didn't answer. Her discomfort with my lack of performance was its own quiet satisfaction. I moved to the last seat. My husband glanced at me briefly, not with gratitude, not with kindness, but with that familiar flicker of irritation. The kind a man feels when something he expects to obey begins showing a spine. As I set his plate down, his fingers brushed mine. Not an affectionate gesture, a silent correction, a tightening grip, a reminder of who he thought I was supposed to be. You're being difficult tonight, he murmured. I gave him a soft, even look. I'm being myself. He frowned, unsettled by how little that statement revealed. The table filled again with chatter, business deals, vacation plans, trivial victories they inflated to feel important. The chandelier light shimmered across polished faces, casting reflections that looked almost regal. Almost. Because when you've seen people at their core, their shine becomes transparent. A guest lifted his glass for a toast. To family, he said warmly, and to the home that holds us together. Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me. My husband shot me a warning glance, subtle but sharp. I lifted mine slowly, just enough to blend in. They drank with pride, comfort, and absolute certainty in the world beneath their feet. And none of them realized the ink on my deed had already begun rewriting their future. What happened next would shake the ground they thought was theirs. After dessert, the guests drifted into the living room, a space staged like a magazine spread, marble fireplace, velvet seating, curated art that none of them could interpret but all of them claimed to love. I stayed a few steps behind, collecting plates, letting their voices blur into one soft, privileged chorus. Don't take too long, my mother-in-law called out cheerfully. We'll need more tea. The dismissiveness wasn't the sting, it was the normalcy of it. The way they said my name only when they needed something, and even then, only if they remembered. As I carried the last stack of dishes into the kitchen, I paused by the doorway. Not to rest. Not to breathe. just to watch them. My husband, legs spread, holding court with a smug ease he hadn't earned. My sister-in-law perched on the sofa arm like a porcelain doll. My father-in-law leaning back, recounting an old business deal as if he had personally shaped the economy. These people, so sure of their status. So certain of hierarchy. So unaware of the quiet erosion happening beneath them, paper by paper, signature by signature. I turned back to the sink. The warm water ran over my fingers, softening the edges of my thoughts. I remembered the meeting with the seller earlier that week, his small office tucked behind an electronics repair shop, nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. But the documents he pulled out, those were powerful. Transfer of ownership, zoning history, the land registry records listing the plot number of my in-laws' glorious mansion. He had looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You're young to be buying land like this," he had said. "I'm just correcting something," I replied. He didn't ask questions. People who work quietly usually understand the value of silence. As the water drained from the last plate, a faint vibration buzzed in my pocket. My phone. I dried my hands and checked the screen. A message from my lawyer. Final confirmation. Transfer completed. Title in your name. My breath didn't hitch. My pulse didn't rise. It was a calm that felt like stepping into a new skin. I looked once more toward the living room, where their laughter floated, light and careless. They still believed they were untouchable. But the ground beneath them had already shifted, and none of them had noticed the first crack forming. The moment they did would change everything. I walked back into the living room carrying the tea tray, each step measured, quiet, almost ceremonial. The room glowed with the soft amber of the fireplace, shadows slipping across the walls like they were eavesdropping. My mother-in-law spotted me first. "Good, you're here," she said, waving 2 fingers toward the coffee table without bothering to look directly at me. "Set it down." I did, placing each cup in front of her guests. Their hands reached out automatically, without thanks, without acknowledgement, just expectation. "Be careful with the sugar bowl," my sister-in-law said. "Last time you almost dropped it." I didn't respond. That lie was one of her favorites. As I handed a cup to my father-in-law, he gave a small, approving nod, not to me, but to the fact that the tea was the exact temperature he preferred. In his mind, perfection wasn't a skill, it was obedience. My husband didn't touch his cup. He was too absorbed in bragging about his vision for future investments, words he borrowed from someone else and ideas he didn't understand. The men around him nodded along, as if admiration were a currency they could afford to waste. I stood near the wall, a silent presence they had decided was peripheral. But silence is deceptive. Silence watches. Silence waits. Their conversations flowed, self-important and predictable. Business wins. Family alliances. Future expansions. The kind of talk that always assumed growth would continue in a straight line, up, up, up. No one mentioned the land beneath their feet. Why would they? People rarely consider the foundation when they think they own the house. Through the sliding glass doors, the garden shimmered under its soft lights. Everything looked pristine, expensive, immovable. They loved posing out there for photos, the perfect family image, the perfect backdrop. But I was the only one in that room who knew that the manicured hedges, the stone pathway, the entire stretch of earth from the front gate to the back fence, was mine. A guest turned to my husband. "Are you still planning to expand the property? Build that guest house?" He grinned. "Absolutely. The land's basically our legacy." I felt the smallest flicker of something, not joy, not triumph. Something quieter. Something truer. Legacy. Such a fragile word when built on someone else's ground. I lifted his untouched tea and placed it gently beside him. He didn't notice. But soon, he would. And when he finally did, he'd realize the truth far too late to stop what came next. The evening wound down in slow, predictable spirals, laughter thinning, wine glasses emptying, conversations drifting into the comfortable nostalgia of people who believed tomorrow would look exactly like today. My mother-in-law rose from her seat, smoothing the front of her dress with both palms. "Well," she announced, "another beautiful night in our home." The emphasis wasn't subtle. It never was. She turned to the guests. "You know, when we built this place, the contractor said it was the most valuable plot in the district. Prime land. Stable ground. Stable ground." I almost smiled. The guests murmured their admiration as she led them toward the front hall. My father-in-law followed, chest puffed, recounting the story of negotiating the original purchase. A story he'd polished over the years until it gleamed with self-congratulation. I stayed behind a moment, gathering the empty cups. My husband remained on the couch, scrolling through a stock app, his brow creased in annoyance. He didn't look up as he spoke. "You really need to work on how you come off to people." I set the cups on the tray. "How I come off?" "You're stiff," he said, waving a hand without looking. "It makes the family uncomfortable. You don't blend." I met his profile calmly. "I'm not supposed to blend." He exhaled sharply, not anger, just inconvenience. "Just try, okay? Mom said she's embarrassed when you act distant." Distant. A word often chosen by people who mistake silence for absence. I didn't argue. I didn't promise anything. Promises were for people seeking approval. I was past that. As I stepped into the hallway with the tray, I caught the tail end of my mother-in-law's conversation as she hugged one of her friends goodbye. "She means well," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "But you can't expect refinement from someone who wasn't raised in it." Her friend tooted sympathetically. "It must be hard," she said. "Having an outsider in the family." I paused, just for a breath, before moving past them. Not because their words hurt, they didn't anymore, but because they revealed something important. Their arrogance wasn't personal. It was generational. Inherited like jewelry, passed down like tableware. They believed their world was unshakable because it had always been handed to them. But inheritance can't protect anyone from the truth. And they were only days away from learning that everything they stood on was never truly theirs. What they discovered next would start the unraveling they never saw coming. The last car pulled away from the driveway, its headlights sweeping briefly across the stone pillars before dissolving into the night. The house fell into a soft, echoing silence, the kind that exposes everything people try to hide in the noise. My husband shut the door with a tired exhale. "God, they stayed too long," he muttered. "Mom gets clingy when she drinks." I set the tray on the counter and began rinsing the cups. He lingered near the hallway, shifting his weight like a man deciding whether to speak or retreat. Eventually, he chose neither. Instead, he wandered to the living room and dropped onto the couch with a frustrated groan. "You know," he called out, "you could have tried harder tonight." Water ran over my hands. Warm. Steady. Unbothered. "Tried what exactly?" I asked. "To fit in," he said. "Not make everything so tense. People notice when you're distant, you know? It reflects on me." There it was, not concern, not partnership. Image. Always image. I dried my hands and stepped into the doorway. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed glued to the muted television, a news anchor talking about rising property values across the city. "That's interesting," I said quietly. "What is?" "The news," I replied. "The part about land appreciation." He snorted. "Yeah, well, it's good for us. We're sitting on a gold mine. Dad says this district will double in value in a few years." I walked further into the room, my steps soft against the rug. "Your father is confident," I said. "He should be," he replied. "He secured this land himself. Best move he ever made. I watched the back of his head, the certainty in the tilt of his posture, the comfort in the lie he still believed. What if the land wasn't his? I asked. He paused. His thumb hovered over the remote. That single moment, a flicker of stillness, cut through the room like cold air. What? He turned finally, eyebrows pinched. What's that supposed to mean? I held his gaze, letting silence answer first. The slow, deliberate kind. The kind that tells the truth before any words do. I'm just wondering, I said softly, how confident someone should be when they're building their life on something they never truly owned. His expression tightened. Suspicion bloomed. And the first seeds of fear, quiet, small, but unmistakable, began to take root. He still didn't know the full truth. But he was about to start asking the right questions. He muted the TV, remote poised in his hand like a weapon he didn't know how to use. What are you talking about? He asked, voice low, trying, and failing, to sound casual. I didn't move closer. Distance made truth easier to shape. You said your father secured this land, I replied. That he negotiated it. Claimed it. Built a legacy on it. He blinked, irritation slowly hardening into confusion. Yeah. Everyone knows that. What's your point? I studied him, the defiance in his jaw, the tightening in his shoulders, all small signs of a man sensing the ground shift but refusing to believe it. My point, I said softly, is that stories can be rewritten. Or corrected. He narrowed his eyes. You're being cryptic again. If you have something to say, just say it. I will, I said. But timing matters. His laugh was sharp, humorless. God, there you go with your dramatic pauses. Just spit it out. But I didn't. Not yet. Timing mattered because truth, when delivered at the wrong moment, can feel like noise. Delivered at the right moment, it becomes a fault line. He stood abruptly, pacing once, stopping near the window that overlooked the garden. Look, he said, rubbing his forehead, I've had a long night. My parents were already judging everything, the food, the music, you. I don't need more stress. I watched the tension coil through him, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the world he'd built on me. I'm not trying to stress you, I said quietly. I'm trying to prepare you. He froze. Not because of the words, but the tone, calm, measured, the tone I only used when something irreversible was already set in motion. Prepare me for what? He asked, voice barely steady. I stepped closer, not enough to comfort, not enough to threaten, just enough to let him see the truth settling behind my eyes. For a change, I said. A shift in what you think is yours. His lips parted, but no sound came out. What did you do? He whispered. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because the next step wasn't meant to be told. It was meant to be discovered. And what he found next would shatter the illusion his family had built for decades. He moved toward me as if approaching a ledge he had never noticed before. What did you do? He repeated, each word thinner, more fragile. I watched him the way one watches a storm forming far off, with patience, acceptance, and an understanding of inevitability. I asked questions, I said calmly. About the land. The purchase. The original deed. He shook his head immediately. No. No, there's nothing to ask. My dad handled everything. Years ago. It's ours. That's what he told you. His jaw clenched. Stop talking like you know something. I didn't raise my voice. I never needed to. I know exactly what they never bothered to check, I said. Or what they assumed could never change. He took 2 steps toward me, eyes sharp, searching my face for any sign of bluff. Are you saying my father lied? No, I said softly. I'm saying he never owned what he thought he did. His breath hitched, the tiny, involuntary sound he tried to swallow. What the hell does that mean? It means, I said, that when the land was divided decades ago, the documentation was never updated properly. The seller's family kept quiet. Your family never verified anything. They built this house assuming the purchase was clean. I paused, letting the truth settle. It wasn't. He sank down onto the arm of the sofa, the air leaving him in a slow exhale. That's impossible. It's common, I replied. People who think they're above the system rarely check the system. His hands ran through his hair, fingers trembling just slightly. And you, he looked up sharply, you what? You just happened to find this out? No, I said. I looked for it. Why, he whispered. Because humiliation sharpens the mind. Because endurance teaches you where the cracks are. Because eventually, silence becomes strategy. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I gave him the truth he was ready for. Because when someone keeps reminding you you're an outsider, I said, you start looking closely at what they call theirs. His face drained of color. A long beat of silence hung between us, vibrating like a wire pulled too tight. Tell me you're lying, he said quietly. I didn't. Because the next words he heard wouldn't come from me. They would come from the papers he would soon see. The ones carrying my name where his father's should have been. And what he discovered next would break the last illusion holding him together. You said, Part 12 stories said. Here is Part 12, the reveal, delivered with calm precision and cinematic emotional weight. 300-400 words, ending with a final rehook for the next chapter or conclusion. Part 12. He stood up again, too fast this time, as if the room had tilted without warning. Show me, he demanded. If you're telling the truth, then show me. His voice shook on the last word, not from anger, but from something far more unfamiliar to him, vulnerability. I walked past him without responding, heading toward the small study at the end of the hall. My steps were steady. His were not, he followed with uneven breaths, each one sharper than the last. When we reached the doorway, I flicked on the light. The room filled with a soft glow, revealing the folder on the desk, a plain manila folder, unassuming, almost gentle. But the contents inside were anything but. I opened it with a careful hand. The air shifted behind me as he leaned closer. The first page was the land registry record. The second, the correction notice. The third, the updated title. His eyes scanned the documents faster than his mind could process them. No, he whispered, shaking his head. This can't be right. This is a mistake. It isn't, I said. He grabbed the next page, then the next, flipping through them with frantic hands, a stark contrast to the calm that filled the room. Every line he read stripped away a layer of certainty he'd worn his entire life. This title, he stammered, tapping the paper as if it might rewrite itself. It says your name. Yes. But how? Why? When did, his voice cracked. Why would you do this? I met his eyes, not with triumph, not with cruelty, only truth. Because your family treated me like someone who didn't belong, I said softly. And the only thing stronger than belonging is ownership. He stepped back as if the words had weight. You bought it, he whispered. Behind our backs. Behind my father's back. I didn't buy it behind anyone's back, I said. I bought it because no one thought I could. Silence thickened between us. Not the peaceful kind. The revelatory kind, the kind that forces people to confront themselves. He sank into the nearest chair, staring at the papers spread across the desk like a map of a world he no longer recognized. My parents, he said, voice hollow. They're going to lose everything. No, I corrected gently. They're going to face the truth. His eyes lifted to mine, desperate, searching for a softness I no longer owed him. What happens now, he whispered. I closed the folder with deliberate care. The soft click of cardboard meeting cardboard felt like the closing of a door. What happens next, I said, is already in motion. And what his family learned next would be the moment everything finally broke.